All right. Hello, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, everyone around in between. This is NFA LD Debate Sensei, where we have our expert guest, Chad Meadows, the director of debate from Western Kentucky, joining us and giving us sort of the background and inside scoop on these questions and issues that surround sort of competing in NFA LD tournaments. Thank you very much, Chad, for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and start talking about the topic a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, because it's been a lot of process and a little bit more the sort of the community and the culture and how that's set up. And now we get to dive in. Now I come from a limited preparation background, and that's mostly what I coach. But when I did do a little bit of LD coaching, I noticed that the way that you kind of treat the topic in the debate has a little bit different feel, whereas there's a premium in limited preparation debate in being a little unorthodox, right? And so like kind of throwing curveballs and getting people a little rocked off on their heels. Would you say that I'm sure that exists, but would you say it's much more likely that you're kind of doing a predictable ground and approach to understanding the topic?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a little bit more emphasis placed on being predictable and straight up whenever you are approaching the topic, especially from some teams. And when the topic is season long, you got to kind of time out the situations and circumstances in which you want to be unorthodox, because there are only so many unorthodox ideas that you can put up per season. So you want to bring those out at the opportune times.
All right. Well, let's start off with some. I like kind of going piece by piece with resolutions. And so the resolution, just to reiterate, is resolved: the United States federal government should substantially reduce the number and or role of its nuclear weapons. All right. Real quick question: does it always start off with resolved in NFALD, the word?
Yeah, usually. To what extent that it's changing or doing anything to the sentence, I'm not sure. Sometimes I feel like the word resolved before debate topics is just kind of an affectation of times past when it maybe had some substantial impact on the debate itself. But yeah, most topics do. If not every topic starts off with the word resolved.
I sometimes get students asking me why it starts with it. What do you tell your students?
So I basically tell my students that it's just kind of like a way of presenting the topic that if you're affirmative, you are resolved, you're resolute, and that the topic statement is true. I've seen some framework debates where the definition of resolved kind of comes up in those discussions. So framework debates being debates where the affirmative doesn't read a traditional plan and it sort of like attempts to insert a different approach to affirming the resolution or not affirming the resolution while still being AF. There's potentially some debates about, does the word resolved mean that, as an individual, I should be resolved about this statement, or does the word resolved sort of like suggest an impending policy choice? So those are really the only circumstances where I see resolved coming up. I would say in like 95% of debates, the word resolved is just there, and it just kind of is. I don't know. I think it's just an aesthetic thing at this point.
Right. And so you have the little colon. All right, and then United States federal government. Even that can be leveraged in a debate to some degree, right? And so. Like especially if you have agency specification, I guess, right? Is that a strategy? Does that strategy stem from these words here?
It won't be a strategy from our team, but I think it definitely is a strategy. So debates and the public policy discussions, for better or worse, historically, at least from since the merger of CDET and DT, in both NFA LD and college policy have mostly focused around action by the federal government. Interestingly, though, I've noticed that a lot of policy topics now just say the United States should,
Okay.
providing a little bit, I think, more ground for creativity. But the vast majority, if not all, topics from NFA LD, I do start with the United States federal government. And, it's an open question as to which branch of the government, executive, legislative, judicial, the affirmative may choose to specify that they are proposing an action by, or they may choose to not specify that. And that could be like a part of the debate.
That's interesting. Like when you say that the three branches of government, now I'm wondering, is there a plan text that would have the judicial branch as the agent?
That would be one of those curveballs, wouldn't it?
Right. Well, for nuclear weapons, though, I mean, what would that even look like? Is it even possible? Like, and then so you can see how my mind starts working. I'm like, oh, now I want to do
something.
Like the Supreme Court doing some sort of ruling. How can I do that? Where can I find the lit that'll support that?
I think there's a history in Supreme Court literature that discusses the extent to which the Supreme Court should or can be involved in decisions regarding foreign policy. Mostly, the Supreme Court has decided for itself that its role should be incredibly limited, if not none. But maybe like a part of an affirmative could be to change that. I think in terms of like the United States federal government for this topic, I find that most affirmatives are going to be describing executive action. The president exercises, a significant amount of latitude with regard to America's nuclear strategy. Something called the Nuclear Posture Review, which basically is each administration's update on how they sort of see nuclear weapons playing a role in their administration. Defines nuclear weapons in foreign policy, and that's put out by the executive branch. So, to a large extent, when we're talking about the federal government and nuclear weapons, we're talking about the executive. Though Congress definitely has a role to play, and some would argue should have more of a role to play.
Okay. It's amazing how even just those phrases that we take for granted can actually be like little points of leverage to do something. Like even the next word, substantially. I've heard some ways that people kind of tease apart that, like the choice to use substantially rather than significantly, for instance, right? Where like the word substantially could imply something of actual substance,
right?
Like physically taking up space and time. Have you ever come across those in rounds, or you have to prep that out?
Yeah. So, I think substantially takes on a variety of dimensions. I would say like the very first kind of sort of like debate regarding substantially is substantially indicating sort of a qualitative modifier to the word reduce, or is it indicating some kind of a quantitative qualifier to the word reduce? That's a huge debate with substantially. So the folks, mostly negative, when they read topicality, may, in previous court rulings, find where courts have had to interpret statutes with the word substantial or significant in them, and then apply some sort of, direct quantitative test for that word. And so the debaters have taken those rulings and then brought those into debate and said, okay, in this particular, court ruling, they found that substantial in the statute meant 50%.
Right.
So we're going to argue that to substantially reduce the number of nuclear weapons, the affirmative would have to at least reduce by 50%.
Right.
And then there's also sort of like part of the literature even that discusses the idea of substantial being like a qualitative like modifier. meaning that it doesn't imply some sort of like direct quantitative threshold, but it's really just sort of like an eye test, back to the Supreme Court with their sort of, test for what is pornography. When you see
Right.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The same thing with substantial. What is an important, and large policy with regard to nuclear weapons when you see it, because it, is important and it feels big. And I think there's also a material component too. To what extent does, any one affirmative, tangibly reduce the like material number of nuclear weapons?
Right.
It can snowball from there. If we're talking about reducing the number of nuclear weapons, how does one reduce the number of nuclear
Right.
weapons, right? Do you just like take them out of, the purview of the United States military and kind of retire them? Where do they go?
Yeah. Where's the fizz of material go? I mean, like, you got to think about what that waste happens to.
Exactly, yeah. Does it mean you have to destroy the nuclear weapons to actually reduce them?
Yeah, Superman 4, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just shoot them up into the sun.
Sure, yeah. I mean, does it reduce the number of nuclear weapons to just like if we bombed China tomorrow?
Yeah.
Does that
Oh, wow.
nuclear weapons?
Oh man, you actually reduce the number by using them. Oh,
Right.
that is that. Oh God,
So you can kind of see how debaters, as you mentioned, they're gonna twist the words in the resolution to kind of always test the boundaries of the good intentions of the topic writer. I've been a topic writer for LD, for public forum of public policy topics, and it really, no matter how hard you try,
right,
to outsmart the debaters with the perfect wording, the debaters are going to figure out a way to
right.
make it their own and to really test the boundaries of those wordings.
Man, then I must have been your worst nightmare, because I loved doing that. I love, because now I'm like, okay, how can I run, like, let's use nuclear weapons, right? Oh man, in order to be topical, it's like it feels like you're actually being the opposite, like and still arguing that you meet the definitions. That is crazy. I love it. I love it so much. All right. So, but that brings reduce, right? You were talking about reduce, and that. What are some other ways that, like, the word? What do you have to be careful of when you come across the word reduce?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest thing you have to be careful of is a lot of nuclear policy with regard to reducing the number of nuclear weapons is really linked to arms control treaties.
Okay.
So, we're talking about the START Treaty.
Okay.
We're talking about the TPNW, which we mentioned really, I think, the last episode. The treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons, but no nuclear state signed and agreed to. Most of the literature that talks about reducing nuclear weapons, for the most part, talks about America being a part of arms control agreements that are sort of like negotiated between the United States and other nuclear states, and sort of that being a mechanism to reduce the number of warheads over time. And the topic is about reducing the weapons just the United States, right? Like there's no other actor in the resolution. So I think that
because it has the word "it's" in it, so it's like that's reflective, right, back of the actor, right?
So if the action you're taking is reducing the number of nuclear weapons by someone else,
right?
That may be beyond the topic, extra topical. So I think that affirmatives are going to have a little bit of difficulty finding literature that describes the United States just unilaterally getting rid of a bunch of nuclear weapons.
Okay.
Most of the folks in the literature now, there are folks that I would call sort of like, outsider perspectives,
right?
Who they're not, like the foreign policy or international relations professors from R1 schools who like spend most of their lives just publishing about nuclear weapons and getting op-eds in foreign policy and foreign affairs. That to me would kind of be like the insider take.
Right.
And most of those folks, their kind of primary advocacy centers around how do we revive some of these arms control treaties that have fallen by the wayside as the United States and Russia have become, even less cooperative with regards to nuclear weapons than they were at any point since the Cold War.
Right. Okay. So reducing its nuclear weapons, that becomes an important way because, it becomes internal. I didn't know that it was so hard to find justifications for unilaterally just getting rid of nuclear weapons. That's kind of sad, isn't it?
Yeah, so I don't think that you will find difficulty finding evidence about why it's good to reduce nuclear weapons.
Yes.
It's just that most of those will be in the context of the United States kind of leading or pushing for arms control agreements with other states. Now, one place that I think that you will find some good literature that kind of will be along this like reduce component will be folks who kind of dislike one leg of the nuclear triad and kind of want to get rid of that leg. So we mentioned the nuclear triad were ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear bombers, so big airplanes that drop nuclear weapons, and then submarines. So there are a decent chunk of folks who think that we just shouldn't have ICBMs going forward.
Okay.
That we just don't need those anymore. And America is undergoing a process called nuclear modernization, where we're updating a lot of our nuclear infrastructure. And so some of the folks within that, don't want there to be ICBMs.
Okay. So what's going on in my head is we're kind of talking about what's aft ground, but at the same time, you got to think about like what if you're on the neg, what's your ground on that one? And when you said that there's a good population of people that just don't want ICBMs, one of my sort of little pie in the sky ideas were like, what if we use nuclear weapons and just pointed them outward toward killer asteroids, right? It's like, so we keep them, we're not reducing the number. I mean, does that, what I'm wondering is that neg ground, or would that be considered reducing the role and therefore aft ground?
I think that it would depend on what the affirmative plan was, but I think it could maybe be either way. The way that it's written is kind of hard to say, if that makes sense.
Got it. Okay.
That's the other direction. But it's cool that you mentioned neg ground, because I think that the neg ground on the topic is great. There's a lot of authors who, I think there's honestly just as many authors who dedicate their lives to writing a bunch of publications demanding that we keep our nuclear weapons the same, if not increasing them, as there are authors who want us to get rid of nuclear weapons. So I think
it's interesting. I would not have predicted that. I'm not really deep on the literature right now, so it's interesting to get that perspective. Yeah. Okay, so there's plenty. Obviously, though, I mean, that's why the topic was chosen, is because the people who authored the topic paper know that the literature is out there.
Yeah. I would say that the negative ground on the topic, when we're talking about disadvantages,
right?
Once you get past disadvantages into like counterplan strategies, critique strategies, etc., things really snowball. But I think for novices and folks who are starting out, the topic is about disadvantages, and I think it really centers on two that are I think really central. One is deterrence, and the other is assurances. So basically, the United States has a nuclear arsenal. A big part of why we maintain it and why a lot of folks think it's important is because the fact that we have nuclear weapons prevents adversarial states from being as aggressive as they would be with the knowledge that we have nuclear weapons that can be used in conflict. And so kind of the basic neg idea being, if you get rid of nuclear weapons or make them a less prominent part of our foreign policy, well, then we're not going to be as good at preventing adversarial states from taking actions that we don't want, and that could cause conflict. Then another thing that we use nuclear weapons for that I think is net ground is we use them to assure states that we're close to, that we are allied with, that we can protect their interests. And a decent part of how we assure those states that they don't need to take actions that are escalatory or could start arms races by acquiring better and more military capability is because, well, you're allied with a country like the U.S. who has a very capable nuclear arsenal, and so you can kind of stand pat with the knowledge that we're there backing you up. So that's you're talking about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so countries in Western Europe, some in Central Europe now, and then also Canada. You're talking about Australia. You're talking about Japan, South Korea.
Right.
Especially in the case of South Korea, countries that may be very close to states with nuclear weapons that are quite antagonistic towards their interests. So, South Korea, North Korea, not homies, not friends.
Right.
North Korea has nuclear weapons. South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons. And they're a rich country, relative to the sort of like scope of countries. They're a relatively wealthy state. If they really wanted to, they could figure out how to get nuclear weapons. They don't, because America has what's known as a security guarantee or a positive assurance that, hey, don't worry about getting nuclear weapons and, making China nervous, making Japan go, hey, why do they get to have the bomb? And there's an interest the U.S. has in states that we're friends with, even not getting nuclear weapons and proliferating.
Yeah, so those two disadvantages about deterrence and assurance, you think about it, it's like you should be able to run that no matter what. You know what I mean? You should predictably have that ground, right? And that's how I always think about net ground. I'm like, okay, if I'm on the affirmative, what case am I running? But if I'm on the negative, what type of ground can I predictably prepare for no matter what the affirmative says? I have to adapt to what they say, but I'm adapting from some point, some predictable area as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those do sound pretty good. So hold on, let's take a look at some of the other words here. So the number and or role. Now I'm kind of looking at this as a phrase because the number seems pretty easy. That's like, if you want to be topical, you're like, all right, here's the number that we're reducing it by. It's going to be like by 50%. We're going to meet your substantial. Like it's just like, let's just get past the topic and have a debate.
Yeah.
But it seems like the word role is where people can really play. And the fact that it says and or. So like you could choose both or just one.
Right. So role is going to be, I think, the sticky part of the topic, as you are already kind of noticing, because what the role of nuclear weapons are to the United States, I think, first of all, depends on how formally you're using that term, and this is in the literature. If the literature is using the term role in a more colloquial sense, meaning just casual sense, then they're likely just talking about to what extent do nuclear weapons sort of like play a part in our foreign policy objectives. When we are talking to adversaries, how much do nuclear weapons play into whether or not we attempt to dissuade their actions? If we're talking to allies, how much do nuclear weapons play into what security guarantees we're giving them, right? It's just there's a lot of literature that uses it in a colloquial sense. It's also in the nuclear posture review, which, as I mentioned, is a periodic update from the administration with regard to what they see nuclear weapons as in their foreign policy and strategy. And the Nuclear Posture Review basically says there are 3 roles of nuclear weapons: deterring strategic attacks, assuring allies and partners, and achieving U.S. objectives if deterrence fails, which kind of sounds like they're going to blow somebody out of the sky to me.
Right.
They treat it as achieving objectives.
Oh man, yeah, that is ominous.
It really is. So I think in a very, and I think the debate that will happen in terms of topicality will be: can affirmatives take on actions that are reducing the role of nuclear weapons in a colloquial sense, or do they need to eliminate one of those very broad roles of nuclear weapons as prescribed in the Nuclear Posture Review? I think that is going to be the debate that happens on topicality.
So yeah, that posture review seems like it's coming up a lot, and it seems to be the foundation of the sort of the core negative strategy. Now, other negative strategies can be developed that have, not a whole lot to do with the topic as much as they do with how the affirmative is going about it. And so like the, repurposing nukes for killer asteroids sort of thing.
Right.
That's not necessarily topical one way or the other, and so yeah, I can see how that's a little bit tricky. I decided to put a prompt into ChatGPT asking for some unorthodox ways in which somebody might interpret this, and one of them that I thought was just bonkers was the what they called the satirical approach, where the debater might argue that they should substantially increase the number of nuclear weapons in order to reduce the role of nuclear weapons because it will be so large that it will be mocked, and reducing the symbolic power of nuclear weapons.
That might be. I don't know. I don't know what the resolution really has to say on an action. Let's even take it further, right? Because they're kind of, let's say, what if one could find an action that would reduce the number of nuclear weapons but increase the role of nuclear weapons, or vice versa, reducing the role? I mean, it says and or, so
you don't have to commit both,
right? So, and to what extent does that make net ground not as stable as it may first appear?
Right. Like, and how would you prepare for that? How would you have literature on large? I mean, I guess large arsenals are never seen as, as punchlines of jokes or anything like that. I mean, how do you? Yeah,
maybe it's a large arsenal of goofy weapons, though. They're so low yield, they're like microwaves.
Or what if you just painted the ICBM's silly colors? Would that make it? Yeah, put little
GPT might be onto something here.
Oh man, and you just dress them up in tutus, and so now it seems like silly. They
critical laugh by the end of the
year. Having that, oh man, yeah. So what else? There's the psychological reduction that you should focusing on the public perception, and so what if you just had a marketing team put together a way to make people think about nuclear weapons less?
Right. I mean, it doesn't say to whom the role of nuclear weapons has to be reduced.
Right.
It has to be reduced. So what role does nuclear weapons play in the life of the everyday person?
Oh man.
So that's where, I think that debate kind of happens. It's, are we talking about the role of nuclear weapons in a colloquial sense?
Right.
Or is it more a strict interpretation that comes from the Nuclear Posture Review? I think apps that are creative will be like, no, you'll be able to find cards that will say this action would reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And I think negs will have to find a way to win unless they're prepared to just debate the action that the act proposes. But negatives that are relying on topicality will have to find ways to win, that judges should confine the affirmative to only reducing the roles as prescribed in the nuclear posture review.
All right. Well, so there's a lot more areas than I thought at first, seeing that topic in which the directions you can go. And so I love ChatGPT as that brainstorming tool.
All right. Really,
yeah.
Yeah. I think that this topic is kind of like a final shot. I think this topic on face is like a very simple topic with a pretty limited number of aphonetic arguments. But I think the beauty of it, and commending the topic writers and the people who proposed the topic area were Jared Anderson and Justin Perkins from California State University, Sacramento. I think that it's a topic that has a lot of basis, some broad appeal, some broad stuff. But then I think it has the opportunity to kind of sprawl and to be a really interesting season-long topic.
Well, we are recording this prior to the Western Kentucky tournament, but it's going to be posted afterwards. So it's I'm interested to see if anyone has some unique ways that they interpreted it, and if it was effective at all.
Yeah, I'll report back.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so the next thing we're going to be talking about is we're going to be starting to get into affirmatives and thinking about and kind of brainstorming which ones are common and maybe which ones might actually have some literature and some unorthodox approaches as well. All right.
Okay, sweet.
Thank you very much, Chad. It's a pleasure as always.
See you soon.